All right, welcome to our video recap of our next chapter, the novel and history. So before I get into anything with this chapter, I think this is perhaps a unique chapter, and I don't mean to be insulting sounding to Jane Smiley here. When I say, you might be able to predict a lot of what she suggests about the novel in this chapter. Um, Anyone who has written or has read probably recognizes and understands that novels are both artifacts of history, but also are reflective of history as it is occurring. Um, and much of what she talks about here, and I'll get into this in a couple slides in, is stuff that is more kind of interesting history lesson, but also just kind of valuable for our reflecting on our own place in history as creators of novels. So she does say this fairly early on in this chapter. The novel has gotten us from the manners and mores of 14th century Florence to those of 21st century California, and done so by very modest means, not by argument, but by proposing simple, understandable choices about common dilemmas. And the thing I really want to say here is that, what I do really like about the language of what she says here is what's at the end: understandable choices, simple, understandable choices about what we call common dilemmas. Because I think, no matter how many bells and whistles, complications, complexities, difficulties, philosophical conundrums there are in the stories that we create, and these are all rich, excellent things to have, there are these common dilemmas that human beings are historically constantly uh, wrestling with. And it's kind of the job of the novel, amongst many jobs, as we've seen from our reading so far, for the novel to think about these things and to be reflections of them and to think through them. And I think it's just at the metacognitive level worth thinking about what are those common dilemmas that exist in our world today and how do they show up in our work today. So you may have noticed in this chapter, she really kind of goes through a number of the quote unquote historical dilemmas that novels have spent a good deal of time looking at. And you're going to see that several of these items on this list are very big, while some of them are very particular. So she begins kind of with her overview of how novels looked at the institution of marriage, broadly defined: its function, its value, the way people perceived it, the way that it sort of informed the world. And then this movement into the really big question that in many ways could kind of umbrella everything else, this question of who am I? She talks about Orlando, about several other novels that pose this question in its many different capacities. And you could certainly say that as we look at the bottom of this list, um, individual versus group or community, who am I is still part of that. Identity is who am I. Personal agency is who am I. Social conformity is who am I. Authority and outlawry, those are both who am I questions. So really, who am I, as she describes it, is the great subject of the novel. And so I give you this list because I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time parsing out the various books that she looks at in terms of how they are each examined. But as things that you can think about in terms of where does my novel fit in? How am I placing it within the rest of the books around me, the history around me? You know, just the 20th century novel, she says this on page 171. I am just going to read this. The history of the 20th century, a century of constant movement and change, of shifting boundaries of all sorts, including but not limited to racial, ethnic, geographical, moral, political, economic, and religious, placed a burden upon every thinking person to define and situate himself or herself, if only to attain what every protagonist desires: a sense of oneself as an actor in the plot, with a defined, logical, and justified moral position, a sense that the action of the plot has a meaning, and a sense that the outcome of the plot is understandable. The popularity of the novel was a response to this burden. And so when you think about these various dilemmas that are on this list, they existed for everybody in some capacity at one point or another. And so not just novelists, but individuals who may or may not be readers are always thinking about these things. And so novels are unsurprisingly, like I said, a reflection of that thinking, while also being part of the history that creates the thinking about them. So when we're thinking about writing, there's just a few things that she says that I really want us to, that I find meaningful to pull out of this. And page 165 is kind of a goldmine for this. The very nature of the novel is one in which the protagonists have to contrast in their fates with those around them. I just bring this up first because this is something she mentioned in an earlier chapter. So when we're thinking about what happens to our characters, what they do actively, what they passively receive, what others do unto them, always have to be in some way distinct and different from what the other parts of the world in which the novel exists have going on. And then just thinking broadly about what it is that we're trying to do, this is how novels always work. They expose general problems and analyze them in terms of cause and effect. To these general problems, novels propose solutions that apply to a few privileged characters. When these solutions are disseminated, readers claim at least the possibility of such solutions for themselves. And really, if I move back to this list of these things, you can see how this maps, right? Writers in their novels are having characters experience the problems of these thematic things. And then we're seeing how do they try to solve their problems. And sometimes the problem works, or I'm sorry, sometimes the solution fixes the problem and sometimes it doesn't. But the point is that you as the writer are trying to suggest that certain courses of action will or will not have the outcomes and solutions that a reader may or may not want. You're making a statement about the way the world works, about what it means to be a person in the world. And so I think that really speaks to the core heart of what we're doing as it relates to historical experience, these general problems, this list one last time. And then a couple other things that I just think that it's worth thinking about philosophically when we're talking about what it is that a writer is doing. Every protagonist in every novel answers this question: who am I? By situating him or her or their self somewhere on the continuum between total isolation and total absorption into his, her, or their group, right? And you think about this idea of individual versus community. That's another one of the big ones, of how does one's identity situate them amongst or against those that are around them. And then on the following page, the novel has changed the nature of human consciousness in two ways. It has made readers and audiences more receptive to the ups and downs of everyday concerns, and it has given everyday concerns more ups and downs. So this is one of those fun turns of phrases that Smiley has. You know, this idea of we are receptive to what those up and downs are, but it has also complicated those daily things. You know, when one, and so let's apply this to what she says about marriage. You know, novelists were throughout history making different claims and suggestions about marriage as an institution, as a way of living. And so these books might have the goal of making people think more about the ups and downs of marriage, the complexities, but also making people thought marriage, this is simply the way things are, and this is what it is like, you accept it, but also what are the complications and difficulties of that. And like she says on page 172, it is the novelist's job in some capacity to have sense be made of senseless events. You know, people like to talk about how novels don't have to have internal logic or that weird things can happen in them. But the point is to make some kind of sense out of the senseless. This does not mean that you explain how everything in the world works, but allowing us to see what people can make of the things that they experience. How do you process the world that you live in? How do you understand it? How do you respond to it? How do you react to it? And so those are the kind of big things that I wanted to cover here. You'll notice that I didn't get into the weeds of a lot of what she talks about with individual books. But again, I think the purpose here, the value here, is we can see how we can situate our own writing about these big issues into the historical context in which they exist. And really, to wrap up, this all goes back to that question of why. Why do I write? Why am I doing this project? And why do I think someone should want to read it? How am I either creating a sense of the ups and downs of everyday concerns, and how am I giving these everyday concerns those ups and downs. Okay, that's all I've got.